talk about the SEC, shall we? Okay. The SEC narrative battle has gotten really out of control. Really out of control. And the perfect encapsulation of any argument these days basically is what this SEC thing has turned into. And I'm talking any argument, whether it's sports, politics, anything in life. You have no middle ground, like nobody is willing, seemingly, to cede any kind of middle ground. And you have people just playing straight down party lines. And that's what we have here with the SEC discourse. One of the worst offenders defending the SEC, by the way, actually comes from Big 12 country. And I will tell you about that more in just a moment. But I got caught in the crossfire of this throughout the entire football weekend, which started in earnest on Friday with Georgia Tech, and everybody watching that crazy game. And it just is like the takes, man. I know I will get branded as somebody who's, Big 12 homer, this anti-SEC crusade. I feel like I'm actually pretty well reasoned and reasonable on this. I'm not saying that the SEC is a bad conference. I'm not saying that the Big 12, the Big 12 could send Arizona State into the SEC and they would win the league. But the pushback, the opposite side has been so grossly over-exaggerated, pretending that this SEC is the 2019 version of the SEC, that you kind of have to get a little hyperbolic and feisty to fight it, or else it'll just sit there unchecked and just be a ridiculous notion of where the SEC is in the year of our Lord, 2024, my friends. So my take on the SEC, if you want it here, anybody living in the Twitter mentions, which, by the way, SEC fans, Twitter mentions, a lot of spelling errors. Here's my basic take on the SEC. I do think they are the best conference in the country. Not only do I think that, but Sagarin would agree in Sagarin's conference rankings. Like, I do think the SEC is the best conference in the country. I don't think they have anybody as high level as Oregon. Maybe a Penn State or Ohio State. We'll see. But I think Oregon would be the best team in either conference. But I think the depth of really good teams is better in the SEC. You could look at like a South Carolina for a good example of that. So I do think they're the best league in the country. But they are not miles ahead of everybody else like they used to be. And that is the problem. SEC fans, media, everybody who surrounds that ecosystem seems to be still locked into this idea that the SEC is the same this year as it has been for the previous 15 years, and that there is benefit of the doubt that should be extended at all times because of that run the SEC has been on. And that is simply something that we should not stand for in college football. This isn't the 2022 SEC. This is not 2009 to 2021 SEC. That is not a wild take based on the evidence that we have out there from this year, right? It's not a wild take at all to say that about the SEC. We just saw Georgia go to 8 overtimes with Georgia Tech after falling behind 17-0 and needing really a miracle comeback, aided by the lack of a targeting call on the crucial turnover that happened there. And I'm not blaming the whole game on that because I really don't care. Once it got into overtime, and especially into, the 2-point shootout, and we're in the 8th overtime, like the point had been made long before that. That's the other thing I hated about SEC fans in my mentions all coming back the next day. Oh, well, this aged well. Yeah, it did, because the point absolutely stands. Whether Georgia won in a 2-point shootout in 8 overtimes or had lost the game in regulation, the point stands on its own very firmly. That was the 5th best team in the ACC, and they essentially played Georgia to a stalemate in their home stadium. Georgia is not head and shoulders above everybody else this year. That is just not the case. Alabama, they lost to 2 6-6 teams, Vanderbilt and Oklahoma. The Oklahoma game was not even really close. I mean, they got pretty much drilled by Oklahoma. Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin, who I enjoy. The talk is good for college football. Much as I disagree with his comments about the Big 12 and ACC, I like that he gives us interesting content and discourse and is a fun personality. But my brother in Christ, you just lost to 7-5 Florida, a team that wanted its head coach fired the entire year. You lost earlier this year to 4-8 Kentucky. You cannot then turn around and say, well, we would just go tear up the Big 12. How many Florida and Kentucky level teams are in the Big 12? Like, that is the entire league. And you probably have 1 to 3 teams that are significantly better. And you just lost to a 4-8, 7-5. Like, you lost 2 of those games. If we put you through a Big 12 schedule, you would have lost at least 2 games. We saw it happen this year. That's what would have happened, Lane. You can't do that, man. I knew that this was really a take that, like, I should feel very entrenched in when I saw, of all people, Ari Wasserman from On3 defending this and writing a really well done column about the SEC and its place this year and how different it is from years past. Ari Wasserman is somebody who I used to get look, I think he's good at his job, but I used to get very annoyed with him because he's a guy that, like, lives by the recruiting rankings, like talent composite, no room for budging on that. Stars matter, as all in on that as you possibly could be. And he's the guy saying, look, we got to take a step back this year, man. The SEC is not what the SEC has been. And a lot of it is, it's not just the evidence that we have. It's because, like, we can point to circumstances here that have changed this. Like, before the portal, when it was very easy, it became very easy to transfer, and there are NIL deals that can be done for your second stringers at, like, a Big 12 school, for instance, where you can make more money. Like, that allowed the playing field to be leveled and these teams to not just stockpile like a 3 deep that would be better than anywhere else in Power 4 football, just about. You can't hang on to as much talent like that. So, of course, the gap is going to close a bit. And what do you know? The last 2 years, the SEC has been down a bit. Like, last year, Alabama, Florida State fans, I'll ride with you, should have been left out of the playoff. That should have been an SEC-less playoff last year. But instead, Alabama snuck its way in. So 2 years in a row, you've kind of had a more subdued SEC. And then what happened over the offseason? Nick Saban retired. And Nick Saban had just a wild influence on the SEC media narrative and just everything that happened over the last 15 years. But with him gone and not having that as just like an auto playoff caliber team there, that's going to change things. So this is not a Big 12 homer take to say that the SEC is not what it has been. Maybe it will get back there. Maybe it won't. Maybe we'll look back in 5 years and say, hey, it took some time for this to really sink in for everybody, but that was accurate. We'll see. It remains to be determined. But for now, this year, it's not that league. And that's why it has annoyed me so much. This is not to say anything about the guy personally. I think he does a good job. He's got a great gig at On3. But J.D. Pickell, who is a former Baylor Bear, right, which is a part of this that's frustrating. He said back on November 26th, if I'm the SEC and I'm seeing who's getting a playoff spot over some of our 3-loss teams that would ragdoll them, I may just go start my own playoff path with my own playoff with the Big Ten. Who is Alabama? Alabama would ragdoll Indiana. This isn't even directed necessarily at the Big 12. Alabama would ragdoll SMU? The hell they would. Alabama got ragdolled by Oklahoma. I just saw it 2 weeks ago. It's an asinine take where you're just living in the past. You're living it. That is a take that you should have scheduled for 2020, but instead you popped it out in 2024. It's not good. To me, that's just lazy relying on the past and not paying attention to what's in front of your eyes this year. And then he follows it up after getting a bunch of crap and says, if Georgia had lost tonight, the SEC should still feel this way. So double down on it. And then the one that really got me, there's one more here. and that is him trying to defend himself. Here's what I did not say. I want to see the SEC and Big Ten start their own playoff. What I'm saying, if I'm acting in my best interest as the SEC and I see a 2-loss Big 12 and G5 team getting in over a better 3-loss team, I'm taking action as a conference holding cards. Well, like, okay, that two things. One, yeah, I mean, yes, anybody would do that with the leverage and power, virtually anybody, right? And that's what's going to happen. So there's nothing earth-shattering about that. That's fine. The problem is you threw in that little line about the 3-loss team that would ragdoll these other teams, which that's where you're carrying water for the SEC and just doing bidding for this narrative that used to exist that shouldn't exist in the same way in 2024, because we've got to treat every season on its own like what it is. We can't just be relying on the past 15 to 20 years every single season that the SEC trots out there. It's a different year. So yeah, to me, this is just lazy and relying on the narrative that's been built up for the last 20 years. And, frustrating, but whatever. Reasonable minds can disagree. That was Exhibit A, like perfect example, because it's not just all the Florida Gator burners that I was dealing with in my mentions that will tell you stuff like that. You do every once in a while run into someone who will still say that, even if the Ari Wassermans of the world are wising up to it and looking at it and saying, no, like, hey, this actually isn't it, guys. This isn't it.